The dust clung to everything, a fine, gritty powder that coated the black leather of Arthur Finch's boots, settled on the brim of his fedora, and grated between his teeth with every breath. It was a suffocating, silent protest from the parched earth of Iowa, a land that felt miles away from the bustling, gas-lit avenues of Chicago. The year was 1861, and while the nation teetered on the precipice of war, Arthur's world was one of words and secrets, not cannons and flags. He was a journalist, a seeker of truth, and his current quarry was a story so bizarre and deeply buried, it could either make his career or break his mind. His horse, a tired bay mare named Bess, plodded along the winding dirt track, her hooves stirring up plumes of golden dust that shimmered in the late afternoon sun. The air was thick and humid, a heavy blanket that promised a storm but delivered only sweat. Ahead, the low, rolling hills were a patchwork of dry fields and dark, untamed woods. It was a landscape that felt forgotten by time, a stark contrast to the urgency of his mission. Arthur's assignment was born from a hushed conversation in the back room of a Chicago tavern. A prominent senator, a man of power and influence, had approached Arthur's editor with a personal and deeply troubling request. The senator's son, a young man of considerable intellect, had vanished without a trace while traveling through Iowa. His last known destination was a hotel with a grim, suppressed history, the Pioneer's Rest. The official report was thin, a polite acknowledgement of a missing person. But the senator's desperation and the hefty sum he offered for a private, discreet investigation told a different story. "The place is cursed," the senator had whispered to the editor, his face pale with a terror that Arthur found far more intriguing than any ghost story. "They say it's where history books go to die." Arthur scoffed at the superstition, but the phrase lingered. He'd done his research. The local historical records for that particular area were suspiciously sparse. Mentions of the hotel were brief, almost non-existent, and any accounts of disappearances or strange events had been systematically erased or altered. This wasn't the work of phantoms, this was the work of men with something to hide. A cover-up was far more dangerous and far more fascinating than any specter. He had ridden for days, trading the comfort of a train for the solitude of the trail to avoid drawing attention. The closer he got to the Iowa hills, the more the locals' faces changed. Their easygoing friendliness was replaced by a guarded silence, their eyes darting away when he mentioned the Pioneer's Rest. They spoke of a legend, a place where the unwary were lured and never seen again. The most grotesque rumor centered on the hotel's kitchen, a place where travelers, it was said, were boiled alive in great iron pots. Arthur dismissed the fantastical detail, but the consistency of the tale suggested a kernel of truth. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, the hotel finally came into view. It stood on a desolate rise, its frame a skeletal silhouette against the dying light. The Pioneer's Rest was not a grand establishment, but a sprawling two-story structure of dark, weathered wood, its windows like empty, staring eyes. The porch sagged under the weight of years, and a sign, its lettering faded and peeling, creaked faintly in the hot, still air. It looked less like a place of rest and more like a mausoleum. A sense of unease, cool and insidious, began to snake its way up Arthur's spine. This was not the fear of ghosts, but the primal dread of a predator's lair. He dismounted, tying Bess to a splintered rail, the only sound the hollow thump of his saddlebags hitting the ground. The air, already heavy with humidity, now carried a distinct acrid smell, like burnt ash mixed with something sickly sweet, a smell that felt out of place and deeply wrong. He approached the main door, its paint long gone, and raised his hand to knock. The wood felt cold to the touch. He didn't have to. The door groaned open on its own, revealing a cavernous, dusty interior. The lobby was a mess of faded furniture draped in white sheets. a single flickering lantern illuminating a high counter where a tarnished brass bell sat silently. "Hello?" Arthur's voice echoed in the stillness, swallowed by the oppressive silence. There was no response, only the faint, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, a sound that felt more like a metronome counting down to some unseen end. He stepped inside, his boots kicking up dust motes that danced in the lantern light. The air was stale, musty, and heavy with a scent that was not quite of decay, but of something far more unsettling, a smell of human sorrow, of lives abruptly ended. He was about to turn back to call out again when a figure emerged from a darkened hallway. It was an old man, thin and hunched, his face a roadmap of deep wrinkles and sorrow. His eyes, though weary, held a sharp, panicked light. He wore a simple, dust-covered tunic and held a lantern whose light trembled in his hand. "We don't get much custom anymore," the old man said, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. "And we don't need any more." He didn't ask what Arthur wanted. His eyes, haunted and knowing, already seemed to understand. "I'm here about the senator's son," Arthur said, getting straight to the point. "He was supposed to be staying here." The old man's face went even paler, a mask of fear. He backed away, clutching the lantern tight. That's a story for another time. There's nothing to find here. This is a dead place." "It's not dead if you're in it," Arthur countered, his voice firm. "I'm not leaving until I get some answers. My name is Arthur Finch, and I'm a journalist. I've been sent to find out what happened." The old man, who introduced himself as Josiah, seemed to deflate. His shoulders slumped, and a heavy sigh escaped his lips. He looked at Arthur not with hostility, but with a profound, bone-deep weariness. He gestured to a dusty ledger on the counter. "Sign your name. You can have a room for the night, but you'll find nothing here but ghosts." Arthur's hand trembled only slightly as he took the pen. He signed his name, the scratch of the nib on the page the only sound in the oppressive silence. He looked back at Josiah, whose face was a study in profound, unshakable terror. The old man's eyes seemed to hold all the terrible secrets of the place, but he wasn't going to share them. Arthur knew then that the curse wasn't a legend. It was a lie, and the truth was buried somewhere far more sinister, somewhere in the foul, echoing depths of the hotel's famous or infamous kitchen. As he was led to his room, he heard a faint, metallic clang, a sound that seemed to come from the deepest reaches of the building, a sound that was far too real to be a ghost. He looked down the hallway, a long dark corridor that led to the back of the hotel, and knew that his investigation, his hunt for the truth, would have to begin there. In the cursed kitchen, where the stories and the history books had been carefully and brutally rewritten. The flickering flame of the old lantern cast long, dancing shadows that stretched and shrank along the corridor walls, making the hotel feel less like a building and more like a living, breathing creature. Arthur's footsteps were muffled by the thick layer of dust that carpeted the floor, and the only other sound was the faint, rhythmic creaking of the grandfather clock in the distant lobby. Josiah had given him a key to a room upstairs, but the metallic clang from the back of the building had captured his attention, pulling him forward with an irresistible journalistic curiosity. It was a sound that belonged to the present, not the past. He moved cautiously, his hand on the cold, splintered wood of the wall, his boots silent. The air grew heavier, thicker, and the strange, acrid smell intensified. It was a smell he couldn't quite place, something that was both chemical and organic, a scent that hinted at an industrial process gone horribly wrong. He followed the scent, the trail of the sound, and the path led him to a heavy, swinging door at the end of the hall. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle, his skepticism warring with a rising sense of dread. The dread was not of a ghost, but of something far more tangible and terrible. He pushed the door open, its hinges groaning in protest. He stepped into a space that was both a kitchen and a charnel house. It was a vast, high-ceilinged room, its windows boarded up, leaving it in almost complete darkness, save for the thin slivers of moonlight that cut through the cracks. In the center of the room stood a massive, soot-blackened iron stove, a grotesque monument to some long-forgotten culinary art. On either side of it were two huge, rusted vats, each large enough to hold a man. A thick layer of grime coated everything, the work surfaces, the floor, the walls, and the air was so heavy it felt as though he were breathing a fine, particulate dust. The smell was overpowering now, a stomach-churning mix of old grease, burnt iron, and something else, something distinctly, horrifyingly human. Arthur's eyes, adjusting to the darkness, scanned the room. The metallic clang he had heard echoed in his memory, and he realized it must have come from one of the vats. He approached the one on the left, its exterior streaked with dark, almost black stains. He reached out and touched the cold metal. His fingers came away sticky with a greasy residue. He shone his lantern inside and recoiled. The bottom was lined with a thick, coagulated sludge, a viscous, foul-smelling substance that defied easy identification. It was not soup. It was not water. It was something else entirely. He looked at the other vat, finding it equally grotesque. The legend of boiling travelers now took on a terrifying new dimension in his mind, divorced from any supernatural context. His gaze fell to the floor near the stove. The dust was thick here, a testament to the years of abandonment. But in the center of the room, near one of the vats, was a small area where the dust had been disturbed, swept into a rough pile. And on the stone floor beneath it was a dark, greasy stain, a recent one that had not yet dried. It looked like blood. It had to be. He knelt, his heart thumping against his ribs, and touched it. It was still tacky. This wasn't a historical crime scene. It was a current one. The senator's son wasn't a victim of a historical event, but a very recent one. The truth was not a ghost, but a murder. A sudden sound from the back of the kitchen, a low scuffle, made him freeze. He extinguished his lantern, plunging the room into near-total darkness, and pressed himself against the wall, his heart hammering in his chest. A sliver of moonlight illuminated a figure in the doorway to the scullery. It was a young woman, her silhouette framed by the faint light. She was not a ghost, she was real, and she was carrying a satchel. She moved with a silent purpose, her eyes scanning the room, her gaze resting on the disturbed dust and the stain on the floor. "Who are you?" Arthur's voice was a low whisper, cutting through the silence. The woman jumped, startled, her hand flying to her chest. "Who are you?" She shot back, her voice low and tense. "Are you with them?" "With who?" Arthur asked, stepping out of the shadows. "I'm Arthur Finch. I'm a journalist. I'm here to investigate the disappearance of a traveler." The woman's expression softened, a flicker of suspicion giving way to cautious relief. "A journalist," she repeated, a hint of irony in her voice. "You're a long way from a press. My name is Sarah, and I'm here for the same reason. This hotel took something from my family a long time ago. My great-grandfather came here and he never left. The town said he ran off, but we knew better." Arthur looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. She was younger than him, perhaps in her early 20s, but her eyes held a wisdom and a steel that belied her age. Her clothes were worn but clean, a simple dress and a sturdy pair of boots, suggesting a life of hardship, but also of resilience. "The curse," he said, the word feeling hollow now that he was standing in the very heart of the lie. "There's no curse," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "There's only secrets. My family's farm has been in these hills for generations. We've watched the powerful families grow rich while everyone else struggles. They built this town on lies and blood. They control everything from the sheriffs to the history books." She gestured to the grimy floor. "They're still doing it. My grandfather was a victim. I think your senator's son was too. The stain on the floor. It's recent, isn't it? Just like the disturbed dust. I was here a week ago. This wasn't here. Arthur felt a surge of adrenaline, of confirmation. He was right. It wasn't a ghost story, it was a human horror. He looked at the massive vats, at the dark stains, and suddenly the boiling legend didn't seem so far-fetched, just misinterpreted. He felt a grim certainty. This wasn't a place of hauntings, it was a human slaughterhouse. And they, the living, were the ghosts of the victims, seeking the truth in a place where only lies were allowed to exist. The town wanted him to believe in a curse, because a curse was a force of nature, a thing you couldn't fight. A human conspiracy, however, was a thing you could expose. He looked at Sarah, a stranger who seemed to share his grim determination, and knew that he couldn't face this alone. Their alliance was an unwritten promise, a silent agreement to bring the truth out of the shadows and into the harsh light of day. They had to work together, and they were already running out of time. The silence that followed Sarah's words was more profound than the one before. It was a silence of mutual understanding, of a shared burden. Arthur and Sarah stood in the foul, oppressive air of the kitchen, two outsiders drawn to the same dark magnet. The scent of old blood and lie hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder that their quest was not for a fleeting ghost, but for a solid, terrifying reality. "The sheriff," Arthur said, his mind racing. "Does he know you're here?" Sarah's eyes, even in the faint light, were like chips of steel. "He knows I'm a nuisance. My family, the Millers, we never fit in. We don't ask questions, but we don't forget. My family has lived with the shame of my great-grandfather's disappearance, a man they said was a thief who ran off. But his name was in the ledger. His saddle was found miles away. He had nothing to run from. The senator's son, the timing is too perfect. He was a rich man from the outside, just like your friend. They take what they can from the weak, and they take the wealthy who ask too many questions." Arthur felt a jolt of recognition. Sarah's narrative wasn't just a personal grievance. It was the backbone of a historical conspiracy. He took a step closer, his voice low and serious. "The history books. You said they've been altered. How?" "They pay off the librarians, the town chroniclers. They pressure the families of the missing into silence, threatening to blacken their names. The curse is a story they feed to outsiders. It's a good one. It makes people leave, and it makes them think the problem is supernatural, not human. It deflects suspicion from the real culprits, the founding families of this town. They're the ones who built their fortunes on this." She gestured to the vats and the surrounding mess. The reality of it was a chilling, mundane horror. There were no spirits, no phantoms, only a grotesque system of greed and murder. "Who are they?" Arthur asked. "The Pembrokes, the Galloways, the Finnegans." Sarah rattled off the names, her voice laced with venom. "They own the land, the banks, the local newspaper. They control the sheriff. And they're descendants of the men who worked this very kitchen. They were highwaymen, robbers who lured unsuspecting travelers to their rest stop. They killed them for their valuables, and they used these vats to get rid of the evidence." The word boiling now made a sick, horrifying sense. Not a curse, but a method of disposal. The story was a gruesome one, far worse than any campfire ghost tale. It was a story of human evil, and that was the most terrifying kind of all. "The senator's son," Arthur said, his mind racing. He was a man of logic and research. He would have seen through the curse. He must have gotten close to the truth. "He did," Sarah confirmed, her face grim. "I heard rumors." He was asking questions about the old railway lines, the ones that were meant to come through here but never did. It was a perfect trap. This place was a known stagecoach stop. It's remote, far from any real authorities. Once they had their victims here, they were at their mercy. "We need proof," Arthur said, his journalist's instincts taking over. "Something that connects them directly to this. Something that the sheriff can't ignore." Sarah shook her head. "They've destroyed everything. They've been cleaning up after themselves for generations. The only thing they couldn't clean up was the whispers." "Whispers aren't evidence," Arthur countered. "The senator's son must have found something. He was an investigator. He wouldn't have come out here without a lead, and he wouldn't have kept it in the open." He looked around the kitchen, his eyes searching for something more than just bloodstains. He must have hidden something here, something that would incriminate them. "What's below this?" Sarah's eyes widened. "The cellar. They store the old provisions down there. It's locked up, but I know the way in from the outside. There's a loose stone in the foundation. It leads to a small crawl space. My great-grandfather showed me once when I was a child. He said it was his secret hiding spot for when he was playing games." Her voice broke slightly on the last word. "He must have used it to get in here." Their plan was formed. They would return at dawn, when the risk of being seen was lowest, and gain entry to the cellar. It was a long shot, but it was their only one. The knowledge they had was dangerous, a volatile truth that could either bring them justice or get them killed. Their alliance was sealed not with a handshake, but with a shared gaze of grim determination in a room filled with the ghosts of a very human horror. They were no longer just a journalist and a local. They were accomplices in the hunt for a truth that had been banned from history itself. They would not be swayed by fear or superstition. They would not be deterred. The real curse was not what had happened here, but the fact that it had been kept a secret for so long. The first light of dawn was a faint, bruised purple that bled across the horizon as Arthur and Sarah made their way back to the Pioneer's Rest. The early morning mist clung to the ground like a shroud, muffling their footsteps and obscuring the skeletal shape of the hotel. The air was cool and damp, a brief respite from the oppressive heat of the previous day. But the chill that ran through Arthur's veins was not from the weather. It was the icy grip of anticipation, the dread of what they might find. Sarah led the way, her movements practiced and silent. She knew these woods, these hills, and her confidence was a quiet strength that steadied Arthur's nerves. They circled the hotel, their boots crunching on dry leaves, until they reached the crumbling stone foundation near the rear of the kitchen. "It should be here," Sarah whispered, her fingers tracing the mortar between the stones. "My grandfather said there was a loose one, for a child's secret." She found it. With a grunt and a collective push, a heavy, flat stone slid out, revealing a dark, earthy opening. The air that rushed out smelled of damp soil and mold, but also of something else, stale and cloying, a scent of disuse and forgotten things. Arthur went first, his lantern held high, its beam cutting a narrow, shaky path into the darkness. He crawled on his hands and knees, the dirt cool against his palms. The crawl space was narrow and claustrophobic, but it opened up after a few feet into a larger chamber, the cellar. The cellar was a place of disquieting stillness, cobwebs draped from the low ceiling like shrouds. The stone walls were slick with moisture, and the only other objects were stacks of empty crates, long since picked clean of their contents. A heavy wooden door, bolted shut, led to the interior of the kitchen, their only way back. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice a low breath. "This is where they kept the provisions." But Arthur was not looking at the crates. His eyes were drawn to a corner of the cellar, obscured by a large, overturned wooden barrel. He moved towards it, his heart pounding in his chest. With Sarah's help, they pushed the barrel aside. What they saw made a gasp catch in Sarah's throat. The space was a grim monument to a forgotten horror. Rusted chains dangled from hooks in the ceiling, and on the floor lay crude, corroded tools, a heavy meat cleaver, a rusted saw, and a coiled length of thick rope. This wasn't a provision cellar, it was a slaughterhouse. The provisions were not food, but the bodies of their victims. The cursed kitchen upstairs was just the final grotesque stage of a long and brutal process. As Arthur's lantern beam swept across the floor, it illuminated a small, tightly wrapped package hidden behind a loose stone in the wall. It was wrapped in oilcloth, an attempt to protect it from the damp. He pulled it out, his fingers fumbling with the ties. Inside, he found two items, a thick, leather-bound journal and a small, tarnished brass box. His hands shook as he opened the journal. The handwriting was neat, precise, and distinctly modern, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn world around them. The first page was dated 3 weeks prior. The name scrawled at the top was unmistakable: Liam Sterling, the senator's son. "He was here," Arthur whispered, a mix of grim satisfaction and cold dread settling in his stomach. "He came here, and he found something. He knew what was happening." He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the detailed entries. Liam had not believed in the curse either. He had come here with his own theories, his own research. He had documented the missing historical records, the strange behavior of the locals, and the names of the powerful families who controlled the town. He had written about the local lore of the boiling and had theorized about the true, horrifying process of using lye to dissolve bodies. The journal was not a ghost story. It was a methodical, damning police report, a record of a meticulous investigation. Arthur handed the tarnished brass box to Sarah. She opened it, her breath catching. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a small gold button from a waistcoat and a lock of light brown hair. Sarah's eyes, now filled with tears, looked at the objects. The button matched the senator's son's description in the files. The hair was the same color as the portraits he had seen. "He hid them here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "He was smart. He knew he was in danger. He knew the town would cover it up. He left this for someone to find." But as they looked down at the journal, at the terrifying record of a man who got too close, they realized they were now in the same position. The evidence they held was a death warrant. They had the names, the methods, and the proof of a recent crime. The silence of the town was not out of fear of a supernatural curse, but of a very real, very human conspiracy. The ghosts of the pioneers' rest were not in the walls, but in the living, breathing men who had profited from this macabre trade for generations. And those men were still in power, still covering their tracks. They had to get out, and they had to do it now. The hunters had become the hunted. The air in the cellar felt colder now, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Arthur and Sarah scrambled to gather their evidence, the journal and the small brass box, their movements clumsy with a sudden panicked urgency. The stillness of the cellar no longer felt silent, but watchful. Every creak of the old house above them, every whisper of the wind, felt like a footstep. "We have to go," Arthur urged, his voice low and strained. "We can't stay here. If they're hunting us, this is the first place they'll look." They were halfway to the crawl space when a loud, scraping sound from the top of the cellar steps made them freeze. A heavy bolt slid open with a metallic thud. The wooden door groaned and swung inward, revealing a figure silhouetted against the dim light from the kitchen above. It was the sheriff, a stout, weathered man with a face like a clenched fist. He held a rifle in one hand, its long barrel glinting ominously. Behind him, 2 other men, grim-faced and armed, waited in the shadows. "Drop it, Finch." The sheriff's voice was a low, gravelly command. "And you, girl, put your hands up." Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. The hunter had become the prey. The old, half-crazed proprietor Josiah must have called him. The town's web of complicity ran deeper than they had feared. The curse was a tool, a psychological weapon, and they had just stepped into the trap. "We haven't found anything," Arthur lied, his voice surprisingly steady. "Just a dusty old cellar." The sheriff laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed off the damp stone walls. "Don't lie to me, son. I know what you're here for. That young fool of a senator's boy came here with the same look in his eye. You found his little journal, didn't you? It's all so predictable." Sarah, her face a mask of defiance, stepped forward. "Why are you covering for them, for murderers?" The sheriff's face hardened. "This town has its own way of doing things. We look after our own. We don't need no big city journalists or meddling girls to come and dredge up old dirt. This place is cursed. That's the end of it." He leveled the rifle at Arthur's chest. "Now hand over that book and the box." Arthur's mind raced. He had to think of something, anything. He wasn't going to let Liam Sterling's last words, the truth that cost him his life, fall back into the hands of the killers. He clutched the journal and the box tighter. "You'll have to shoot me," he said, the words surprising even himself. The sheriff's finger tightened on the trigger, but just then, a loud shout from one of the men above caused a momentary distraction. "Sheriff, they're here. The Finnegans just rode up." It was the brief window of opportunity they needed. With a sudden shove, Arthur pushed Sarah behind him, ducked, and kicked a loose stone on the ground towards the sheriff's feet. The sheriff, caught off guard, stumbled. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Arthur scrambled back towards the crawl space as Sarah, with an incredible display of strength and desperation, grabbed a large, empty crate and shoved it against the bottom of the cellar door, wedging it shut. "Run!" she yelled. They clawed their way back into the crawl space, the sounds of the men above them, the shouts and the pounding on the door, a terrifying drumbeat of pursuit. The flimsy barricade of the crate wouldn't hold for long. They wriggled out of the crawl space and into the cool morning air, their clothes and faces streaked with dirt. "We need to get to the woods," Arthur yelled, grabbing Sarah's hand. They ran, a mad dash through the dewy underbrush, the pounding of their hearts echoing the thundering hooves of horses behind them. The sheriff and his men were a relentless force, an organized conspiracy that hunted them with cold, terrifying efficiency. As they ran, a branch snagged the satchel holding the journal. Arthur ripped it free, but the leather strap broke, and the journal, a large, heavy tome, fell to the ground. He didn't have time to retrieve it. A gunshot rang out, the bullet whizzing past his head and lodging in a tree trunk with a dull thud. He could feel the splintered wood hit his face. "Leave it!" Sarah screamed, dragging him forward. "It's too dangerous." They ran, fueled by sheer terror and the desperate need to survive. They left behind the most crucial piece of evidence, but they still had the brass box, the lock of hair, and the button. It wasn't as damning, but it was enough to prove the senator's son had been here. It was a fragment of the truth, a small piece of a gruesome puzzle. As they fled deeper into the dense woods, the shouts and gunshots growing fainter behind them, they knew their situation had gone from a journalistic investigation to a fight for their lives. The sheriff would not be coming for them with a warrant. He would be coming with a rope. They had seen the true face of the curse, and it was a human one, a face of greed and malice. And now they were the next victims on its ledger. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like lead. The sun, now fully risen, filtered through the thick canopy of leaves, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns of light and shadow. They had managed to outrun the sheriff's men for now, their knowledge of the terrain giving them a temporary advantage. They found a small abandoned hunter's cabin, a dilapidated structure of rough-hewn logs tucked away in a small clearing. It was a haven, a place of temporary safety, but the cold dread that had settled in their bones told them it wouldn't last. Inside, the cabin was silent and musty, smelling of old smoke and forgotten seasons. They slumped against the wall, exhausted, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The reality of their situation, fugitives from a powerful murderous conspiracy, settled over them like a suffocating blanket. "The journal," Arthur whispered, the words a raw, painful admission. "We left it. He'll find it. He'll burn it." Sarah, her face streaked with dirt and her hair a tangled mess, shook her head. "He already knows what's in it. It was his, the sheriff's. He was one of them. He was a boy when it happened, but he was here. They all were. The whole town. We've got to face it." Her words hit Arthur with the force of a physical blow. "What do you mean?" Sarah's eyes filled with a raw, agonizing sorrow. "My great-grandfather, I told you he was a victim. That's what my family always told me. But I think it's not the whole story. The sheriff's last name is Finnegan. My great-grandfather's last name was Miller. The Finnegans and the Millers, they lived in the same valley. They were neighbors. Why would they let a neighbor get killed? He was probably a part of it." Her voice dropped to a pained whisper. "My family lied. They hid the truth. They were complicit." The psychological weight of this realization was far more devastating than any physical threat. Arthur, who had been so focused on the senator's son and the dark history of the hotel, now saw the human drama in its full, terrible scope. This wasn't a story of good versus evil. It was a story of survival, of complicity, of families turning a blind eye to atrocity to protect their own. "It explains so much," Arthur said, his mind racing to connect the pieces. The silence, the lack of records, the psychological pressure. They're not just covering up a crime, they're covering up a legacy. Their own legacy. Sarah nodded, her chin trembling. "My great-grandfather was a poor man. He probably needed the money. He probably told himself it was just a few travelers, a few rich men. The curse. It's a way for them to live with it. It's a way for the town to live with what they did. If it was a curse, it wasn't their fault. But it wasn't. It was them." They were quiet for a long moment, the crushing weight of this newfound truth settling between them. The real horror of the pioneers' rest wasn't a ghost in the walls, but the grotesque, mundane evil that had festered in the hearts of men and women. The boiling was not a fantasy, but a practical method of a human crime, a dark secret that had poisoned a community for generations. Arthur, though shaken, was a journalist at his core. He reached for the small brass box he still held, the last piece of physical evidence they had, the button and the lock of hair. "This is all we have left. We can't fight them. We can't go to the authorities. They are the authorities. We have to be smart. We have to find a way to use this to expose them." Sarah, still reeling from the terrible family secret she had just uncovered, looked at him with a dawning sense of purpose. Her earlier sorrow gave way to a hardened resolve. "There's one way. The founding families, the ones who were part of this, they all have their money now, their power. But there was one man who started it all, the original patriarch, the one who built the hotel, the one who orchestrated everything. He's old, but he's still alive. The whispers say he lives in a mansion on the outskirts of town. He's the key. He's the one who can tell the whole story." Arthur looked at her, his mind already forming a plan. Confronting the sheriff and his men was suicide. Going back to the hotel was a death sentence. But confronting the mastermind, the original architect of the conspiracy, the man who had lived with the weight of this grotesque secret for decades, that was a different kind of confrontation. A psychological one. A final, desperate attempt to uncover the truth and bring it to light. The final chapter of The Cursed Hotel was waiting to be written, and they were the only ones who could write it. The hours passed in the cabin, a suffocating silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the frantic whispered planning of Arthur and Sarah. The sun had set, and the woods outside were a vast, impenetrable blanket of darkness. The reality of their situation pressed in on them. They were hunted, their every move watched. The town's conspiracy wasn't a loose collection of scared locals. It was an organized, generational enterprise. The knowledge that Sarah's own family might have been complicit was a heavy, unspoken weight between them, a grim reminder of how deeply the rot went. "We can't go back to the town," Arthur said, his voice barely audible in the darkness. Not without a plan. He felt a sense of defeat, not from the physical threat, but from the realization of the vastness of the lie. How could they expose a conspiracy so deeply ingrained, so protected by the very fabric of the community? Sarah was curled up on the floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, her face hidden in the shadows. "He lives in a house at the edge of town," she said, her voice strained. "He's old now, confined to a wheelchair, I've heard. His family protects him, but they're not with him all the time. He's the last living one who knows the full story. His name is Jeremiah Pembroke." "Pembroke?" Arthur repeated, the name like a vile taste in his mouth. He remembered Sarah listing it as one of the powerful families. The senator's son's journal. It mentioned the name Pembroke. They were the ringleaders. He must have been a boy when it happened, but he was here. They all were. The whole town. We've got to face it. "It's worse than that," Sarah said, her voice a raw whisper. "The whispers in my family. My great-grandfather didn't just turn a blind eye. He helped. He was the one who lured the victims, who gave them directions, who convinced them to go to the hotel. They promised him a share of the money, a share of the land. He wanted a better life for his family. He paid for it with his soul." She shuddered, a body-racking tremor. "My family is a monument to that lie. Our farm, our reputation. It's all built on a grave." The truth was a far more terrifying ghost than any imagined phantom. It was a ghost of a different kind, the ghost of a stolen life, the ghost of a compromised morality, the ghost of a poisoned history. Arthur looked at Sarah, truly seeing the torment on her face. Her personal nightmare was far deeper than his. He was a journalist, an observer. She was a descendant, an inheritor of a terrible sin. He reached out and put a hand on her shoulder, a simple human gesture of solidarity. "We're not them. We're not our ancestors. What we do now is what matters. We can't change the past, but we can stop the lie from living on. We can give those people back their stories. We can give them a name, a date, a reason." Her eyes, raw with pain, met his in the dim light. "We have to. For him." She gestured to the brass box. "For my great-grandfather. For the families who were told their loved ones simply ran away. For the truth." Their plan solidified. They wouldn't fight the sheriff. They wouldn't run forever. They would go back to town and confront Jeremiah Pembroke directly. It was a reckless, desperate gamble, but it was their only chance. Arthur knew the power of a confession, the way a person's conscience, after decades of silence, could break under pressure. The psychological weight of the past was their weapon. The ghosts of the pioneers' rest were not ethereal spirits, but the very real memories that haunted the minds of the men who had built a town on murder. And they were going to use those ghosts to bring the truth to light. The final, terrible showdown was not going to be a physical fight, but a battle for a man's soul and for the soul of an entire community. They were going to make a murderer confess, and in doing so, they would finally break the terrible human curse that had plagued the town for decades. The journey back to town was a tense and nerve-wracking ordeal. They moved at night, sticking to the deeper, less-traveled paths through the woods, their every sense heightened. The air was cool and crisp, a welcome relief from the close heat of the cabin, but the silence was filled with the imagined sounds of pursuit. They were close to the town now, the faint glow of distant lanterns, a beacon of a civilization built on a lie. Jeremiah Pembroke's mansion was on a hill, a grand, ostentatious house with a tall, imposing chimney and manicured gardens. It was a stark contrast to the dilapidated Pioneer's Rest, a testament to the wealth and power that had been built on a foundation of murder. Arthur and Sarah waited in the dark woods that bordered the property, their eyes on the house. The sheriff's men were nowhere in sight, but they knew they were still in danger. Their only hope was to get inside and make their move before the alarm was raised. A lone lantern flickered in a window on the ground floor, a study or a library. It was where the old man would be, reading or simply passing his final days. They circled the house, looking for a way in. A servant's door at the back was unlocked, a lapse in security that spoke of the residents' sense of impregnability. They were so confident in their secret, so certain that no one would dare challenge them. That arrogance would be their undoing. They slipped inside, their footsteps silent on the cold stone floor. The house smelled of old money, of polish and stale cigars. They crept down a long hallway, past framed portraits of stern-faced ancestors, the very men who had built their fortune on the blood of travelers. Their faces were cold and lifeless, their eyes holding the same arrogant superiority that had allowed them to get away with murder for so long. They found the room. The door was slightly ajar, and the soft orange glow of the lantern spilled out into the hall. They peered inside. Jeremiah Pembroke sat in a large leather armchair, an old man shrunken by age, his face a pale, wrinkled map of decades of secrets. He was staring into the fire, his hands, knotted and trembling, resting on a blanket that covered his legs. The years of living with the truth had not haunted him with ghosts, but with the quiet, corroding poison of guilt and fear. Arthur and Sarah exchanged a look. This was it. No guns, no threats, just the power of the truth. They pushed the door open and walked in. The old man's head snapped up. His eyes, though cloudy with age, held a sharp, panicked fear. He didn't recognize them, but he recognized their purpose. He had been expecting this for decades. He looked at Arthur's determined face, at Sarah's raw grief, and he knew they were not random intruders. They were the reckoning. "Who are you?" he croaked, his voice thin and reedy. "My name is Arthur Finch," Arthur said, his voice firm and clear. "And this is Sarah Miller. We're here for the truth about the Pioneer's Rest. We know what happened. We know about the highwaymen. We know about the vats and the lie, and we know who covered it all up." Jeremiah's face was a study in profound, bone-deep terror. He reached for a bell on a small table beside him, a frantic, desperate gesture. "Don't bother," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "We know about your lies. We know about my great-grandfather. You told everyone he was a runaway thief. But he was a tool. He was complicit. He helped you get away with it." The old man's face twisted, the mask of a lifetime of composure cracking. "You don't know anything," he rasped, his voice rising in panic. "It was just a few travelers. They had no one. It was a long time ago. The land was hard. We had to do what we had to do. The curse, it was just a story we told." "No," Arthur said, his voice a low, steady condemnation. "It wasn't a few travelers, it was dozens. We found the senator's son's journal. He was keeping a list. He knew what you did. He was here to expose you, and you killed him, just like you killed all the others. And the sheriff, your son, he's still covering it up. He's hunting us right now." He took a step closer, holding up the small brass box. "We have the proof, his button, his hair." Jeremiah's eyes, filled with a lifetime of guilt, darted to the box. He broke. The composure of decades, the carefully crafted lie, shattered. The dam of his conscience gave way, a torrent of confession pouring out of him. He spoke of his father, of the dark days when the hotel was built, of the ruthless logic of the highwaymen, of using the vats to dissolve the bodies. He spoke of the money, of the power, of the families who are now the backbone of the town, all built on a mountain of secrets and buried bodies. The curse was a ghost story they created to hide a horror far more chilling and real. He was a living testament to the human depravity that had been mistaken for a supernatural force. The confession was a torrent of grim details, of names and dates, of the awful mundane truth of the Pioneer's Rest. The man who had orchestrated so much death and lies was a frail, sobbing husk, his secret finally, painfully, out in the open. The real horror of the Pioneer's Rest was not in the walls, but in the living, breathing heart of a town that had sold its soul for a bloody fortune. The psychological war was won. The truth, in all its brutal human reality, was finally revealed. The old man's confession hung in the air, a choking, palpable weight. His voice, once reedy and frail, had gained a terrible, chilling clarity as he recounted the gruesome details of the past. He was not a man possessed by a ghost, but a man finally unburdening himself of a lifetime of silent terror. The ghosts of the Pioneer's Rest were not specters, but the faces of the people he had wronged, the memories of the crimes he had enabled. "We would make it look like a tragic accident," Jeremiah rasped, his eyes fixed on some unseen horror in the past. A fall from a horse, a drowning in the river. We were clever. We had to be. We had families to feed, names to protect. He spoke of the lie, of the industrial-scale process of murder and disposal, of the cold, calculated cruelty that had been mistaken for a supernatural curse. He was a broken man, his composure gone, his secret finally, terribly out in the open. As he spoke, a sound from outside made them all freeze. The thundering of hooves, the shouts of men, and the telltale creak of a carriage pulling to a stop. The sheriff and his men. They were here. They had tracked Arthur and Sarah to the one place they knew they would go. The home of the last living ringleader. They had been underestimated, their journalistic tenacity taken for childish curiosity. Now the full force of the conspiracy was at the door. "You've been a fool, Finch." A voice boomed from the hall. It was the sheriff, his face a mask of rage. He and two other men burst into the room, their rifles held high. "I knew you couldn't stay away. You just had to see the old man." The sheriff's eyes darted from Arthur and Sarah to his own grandfather, who was still sobbing, lost in the terrible memory of his crimes. The sheriff's face paled. He had heard what his grandfather had been confessing. The family lie, the legacy of blood and murder was coming undone. "You don't have to do this," Arthur said, his voice calm, even though his heart was a frantic drum. He held up the brass box, its polished surface catching the lamplight. "We have the proof. We have the box. We have the lock of hair. We know about the senator's son. We know about the journal. And now we have a full confession from the last man who lived the lie." The sheriff's face, a second ago filled with rage, was now a mask of pure desperation. He had to stop this. He was willing to kill. He raised his rifle, aiming it at Arthur, but before he could pull the trigger, a voice from the doorway stopped him. "Stop, Sheriff." It was Sarah's mother, an elderly woman with the same steely eyes as her daughter. She held a shotgun, her hands trembling but her voice firm. Behind her, other townsfolk had gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity, confusion, and dawning horror. They had been woken by the commotion, drawn by the shouts and the presence of the sheriff's men at the mansion. Sarah had a plan, and it was working. She had sent a small note with a trusted messenger, a plea for help, before they entered the mansion. She told them that the truth would finally be revealed tonight. She had hoped that some of the townspeople, sick of the lie, would come to listen, and they had. "What is this, Millie?" the sheriff growled, but the confidence was gone from his voice. He was not just a sheriff now, but the son of a family whose dark history was about to be exposed. "This is an end, Sheriff," Sarah's mother said, her eyes fixed on Jeremiah Pembroke. It's an end to the lies. We've all been living with it, a little bit of it, for so long. We've all turned a blind eye. The curse was a lie we told ourselves to sleep at night. But the curse was you. It was your family and the ones who helped you. And it ends tonight. The silence in the room was a heavy emotional weight. The people of the town, standing at the door, could now see the truth laid bare. They saw the sheriff's guilt, the old man's confession, and the brave young people who had come to expose it all. The human drama, the family's secrets, the decades of complicity were far more compelling and terrifying than any story of a haunted kitchen. Arthur, his voice ringing with newfound confidence, looked at the crowd. This town has been living under a false curse for decades. The real curse was greed. The real ghosts were the men who made a living from murder. The Pioneer's Rest is not a haunted hotel. It's a crime scene. A place where a terrible lie was born, and it's time for that lie to die. The sheriff, out of options, finally lowered his rifle, the weight of a lifetime of deception too heavy to bear. The truth, once banned from history books, was finally free. The human horror that had festered beneath the surface of this quiet town for generations was finally exposed. The arrest of the sheriff and his men was a quiet and sober affair. The townsfolk, once so tight-lipped and complicit, were now a witness to their own liberation. The old man, Jeremiah Pembroke, was taken into custody, a frail, shrunken figure whose confession had finally set him free, even as it condemned him. The curse of the Pioneer's Rest was broken, not by a magic ritual or a ghostly exorcism, but by the raw, unyielding power of the truth. Word spread like wildfire. The story of the town's dark secret, of the Pioneer's Rest and its macabre history, was now the main topic of conversation. The senator, upon receiving a telegraph from Arthur with the full account and the remaining evidence, immediately sent a team of federal marshals to the town to ensure justice was served. They found the cellar exactly as Arthur and Sarah had described it, a grim monument to a decades-long crime. The case of the senator's son was officially closed, his death solved, his name cleared of any suspicion. The Pioneer's Rest, once a source of local superstition, was now a somber landmark, a real-life testament to the darkest parts of human nature. The legend of the cursed kitchen where travelers were boiled was no longer a ghost story to be whispered at night. It was a history lesson, a grim and unvarnished account of greed, murder, and the human capacity for evil. The town, now forced to face its past, would have to rebuild its identity, not on lies, but on the painful, honest truth. The quiet complicity was replaced by a somber reflection, a new history being written, one that would never be banned from the books again. Arthur Finch, the skeptical journalist, had his story. It was a story far more compelling than any ghost tale, a story of a human conspiracy that had festered for generations, of a town living a lie, and of two individuals who had risked their lives to bring a dark secret to light. He wrote his piece, a raw, uncompromising account that would be published in newspapers across the country. It was a testament to the fact that the most terrifying things in the world are not things that go bump in the night, but the quiet evils that reside in the human heart. He had not only found the missing man's story, he had helped a town find its soul. Sarah Miller, now freed from the psychological burden of her family's complicity, stood with him, looking at the dilapidated hotel. She had faced her own past and found the courage to expose it. She was a different person now, no longer a victim of a lie but an agent of the truth. She and Arthur had forged a bond in fire, a silent understanding that transcended their brief time together. They had both grown, their personal journeys intertwined with the terrible history of the place. They had seen the true face of the curse, and it was the face of their own species. Their work was done. Arthur would return to the city with a story that would define his career. Sarah would stay in the town, not to forget the past, but to ensure it was remembered for what it truly was. As the sun set, casting long, solemn shadows over the pioneer's rest, it felt not like a triumph, but like a somber dawn. The darkness was finally gone, but the scars of the human horror would forever remain, a chilling reminder of a history that was finally and truthfully told.